Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Z. I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in transgender care. Welcome to my channel. Last time I did a video sharing with you four most common typologies that I have personally observed that explain the root origin of gender dysphoria and how a lot of times they do in fact overlap. And I'm sure there are a lot of other root causes of gender dysphoria. I just shared with you top four most common ones, or actually rather the one that I observed in terms of patterns. Two of those were really incredibly rare, and I shared that in that video. I'm going to try to remember to link the video below. If I forget one of you, please let me know that I forgot to link it. Today, I want to share with you how I am starting to understand and I'm starting to conceptualize formation of gender identity in human beings. This is not necessarily in regards to just transgender identity. This is in regards to all of the gender identities out there. How is it as human beings, we psychologically develop what we call gender identity? Is there such thing as gender identity? And if it is, why is it for some people it tends to be more fluid and for some people it tends to be more static? And how does gender dysphoria then affects or plays a role rather in the development and formation of gender identity? This is by no means the model or the theory of construction of gender identity. This is just the way I'm starting to conceptualize it. We have a lot of literature, a lot of books out there to talk about uh, constructions of gender from a social and cultural perspective and historical point of view. But we're lacking an understanding from a psychological point of view. How do we even develop what we call gender identity? How do we even develop and what influences especially the development of gender identity and how we see ourselves in relationship to our gender? So today I want to share with you how I'm starting to see it. The way that I see it makes complete sense to me, but of course I'm having also my own blinders on. It makes sense to me because as a psychologist, it explains to me how gender identity is a natural progression of human development that is situated within individualistic context and current situation. So as you listen this, let me know and comment below what are your thoughts, whether you think that this is resonating, whether you think this makes sense. This, like I said, it makes sense to me why some people have a later onset, for example, even gender dysphoria. It also explains to me how some people's gender identity tends to become more fluid or change or more interchangeable over time, and how for some people it is more static. So before we start, well, let's discuss what the hell is gender identity. We throw that word a lot of times, gender identity, gender identity, gender identity, but what is it? There are some people who will say there is no such thing as gender identity, that gender identity is a new concept created by us in order to justify the variability in genders that we currently see. That there are only two genders. It is male and it is female, period. And those two genders are determined by biological sex, is primarily determined by chromosomal assignment. So if you are born and your chromosomal assignment is XX, you're a woman. If you're born and your chromosomal assignment is XY, you're male. End of story. That is your gender and that is your sex. And there's no such thing as gender identity. There's just maybe gender roles and gender expressions, how you express it, but there's no such thing as gender identity. In my point of view, to me, that is incredibly reductionistic and simplistic way of looking at human development. It also negates the historical documentation and all of the incredible literary works and research works of historians who have documented and discussed the formation of gender as constructs and the formation of, well, actually, quite frankly, binary ideology of genders. It's interesting how people shout out that there's this transgender ideology, but nobody wants to talk about how long and how deeply situated and saturated within the strata of our lives binary ideology is. We don't want to call it binary ideology because then we have to question whether there is gender identity, right? So for me, it's very, very simplistic. Even for the sheer fact that, well, what happens to people whose chromosome assignment is XXY? Are we then saying that they're rendered genderless? This is very rigid. And it's so rigid to the point where it's essentially saying that your gender is determined by sex. And in doing so, your gender is anchored only by sex. It is very inflexible point of view. Then on another end of polarity, we have people who feel the gender is a construct. I agree with that. Who then also feel that because it is a construct, it is not determined by sex. And you can be any gender you want. So whereas here we have a very strong anchor that has a hold on gender, over here we have complete lack of any anchoring, and anything and everything goes, and we're just orbiting. I also don't believe this is true because I don't want to divorce sex from the formation of gender identity. I think it plays a part in it. I don't think it's the only part. And I'll explain once I'll tell you how I understand how I'm starting to formulate the formation of gender identity. So these two views don't make any sense to me. And I am always the type of person that when I see things to be very black and white, very one or another, I always feel that there's has got to be something that explains it by also including those point of views, but in a way where it's not so drastic. Some people might say that, they aspire to what we call naturalism point of view, where basically it is your biology that determines how you see yourself. And then there's some people who ascribe to culturalism point of view, and that is you're born as a blank slate, completely blank slate, and the way you see yourself in relationship to your gender is solely based on the way you were socialized. Again, extremes. I always like to marry things because I think there's always a reason why extremes exist, because each one does has some validity to it, but not to the extremes that they're being presented. So, does gender identity exist? Yes, in my opinion, it absolutely does exist. Especially as a psychologist, I understand that as human beings, as we go through our lifespan of development, we develop micro pockets of strata within ourselves, if you will, a way of seeing ourselves and relating to ourselves. There's micro pockets in relationship to our genders, there's micro pockets in relationship to our profession, there are micro pockets to so many other aspects of us as human beings. And what's interesting to me is that these micro pockets, in my experience, they're not static. Sometimes they can be static, and as time goes by, they become even more stable, if you will. Stable in a sense, not that they are um, unwavering, but in a sense that they become even more less likely to change. And then there's some micro pockets that are much more fluid. And gender is absolutely one of them, just like all of the other aspects of our identity. When we talk about gender identity, and when people say, well, what is gender identity? One of the ways that we like to define it or to explain it is that gender identity is your own innate sense of who you are in relationship to your gender, which I agree with that. I go further in saying that gender identity is your own sense of who you are in relationship to the way you currently see, understand, and perceive what gender is. Why do I make it very distinct to the way each individual sees, understands, and perceives what gender is? Because as you'll see, as I share with you the ways that I think gender identity is formed, my belief is that it is also subject to and is situated within your context, your environment, where you're at in the world. There's a lot of things that go into formation of your gender identity. So in my opinion, gender identity, A, yes, absolutely does exist. And B, I agree, it is your own subjective sense of who you are, because we're talking about subjective sense of perceiving ourselves that is embedded in how we feel about ourselves. That subjectivity is highly individualistic, right? Because how I will feel in relationship to my gender is going to be different how you will feel in relationship to your gender. Even if I identify and I say my gender identity is woman, my relationship to that gender and the ways that I see it and break it down is still going to be different than somebody else's relationships that also says that their identity is a woman. Why? Because there is no one objective, there's no objectivity when it comes to gender. In other words, there's no, this is what a woman is, this is what a man is, this is what a trans woman is, this is what a trans man is, this is what a genderqueer person is. It can't be, because we're not robots. We experience things differently. If I taste strawberry and you taste strawberry, we're going to describe different experiences of tasting that strawberry. And there's not going to be one objective way of what a strawberry tastes like. There could be a common generalization based from extrapolating what majority of people will say it tastes like, but it's still going to be an individualistic experience of what it tastes like. Okay. Now, I know that some people will say that that is not true, and some people are going to say that there's absolutely is what a woman is and a woman is, an anatomical female, and what anatomical female is a woman who's it's a female who's XX and is able to bear children or have reproductive capacity and yada 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 yada. Like I said, I don't aspire to that view, so agree to disagree. Because gender identity is situated within your own sense of subjectivity, imagine that you're standing and you are revolving around. You're revolving around everything that is happening to you in your life. So imagine you're standing on a pedestal, and as you're revolving around the pedestal, whatever comes into your sphere of experience, and I say whatever comes into your sphere of experience, information, how you're being brought up, how people relate to you, traumatic incidences, sexuality, your biological sex, anything and everything, in other words, that shapes and exists in human development. As you're standing on the pedestal and those things revolving around you, they're influencing your relationship to those things and therefore influence your relationship to yourself. So let me put up on a screen this diagram that I'm holding here that I'll be referring to. This is very simple, but I hope it's going to illuminate a point. In the middle of a diagram, imagine this is me, okay? So the way that I understand the formation of gender identity is this. I'm born, and according to other beliefs, I don't believe that I'm born as a completely blank slate. I'm born as I'm born as a human being, and as such, when I am born, I'm already coming in predisposed with certain genetic, my own genetic variability, right? I already born with my particular chromosomal assignment. I'm already born with so many other genetic elements that I have inherited from my family and from my bloodline, from my parents. And I already also come into this world with a lot of other elements. So here I am, I'm born. And right now, culturally, people look at the child's genitals. In my case, they looked at my genitals when I was born and they said, this is a girl, right? So follow me here. So I am born and my parents refer to me as a girl. And as my mom takes me around, everybody refers to me as a girl, right? Because culturally, we are predisposed to believe and to see gender identity anchored by sex. And because of that, we're predisposed to seeing sex as very two extreme opposite. And we're predisposed to differentiate how sex look differently, how females look differently from males. And based on social construct, what I'm predisposed to see is that a female-looking anatomy presentation in a female-looking child is a girl. Even though sometimes we can all agree that newborns, it's even hard to tell what gender they're, right? Because they haven't really formulated so many aspects of the stuff. But follow me here. So here I am. In other words, as I continue to grow, I am rotating on the pedestal. And as my development, you see on the diagram, I have development, lifespan development. As my development progresses, H1, H2, H3, H4, I am, just like layering, I'm collecting experiences that are specific and personal to me, and that are also situated only within my context. I grew up in Russia. It's a very different culture. My parents had their own way of parenting. Everywhere I went, my mom dressed me up in little girl dresses. Everybody would say, what a cute little girl. I mean, there's so many other experiences that were happening, that were coming into my sphere of experience, that were shaping up my inner subjectivity, the ways that I see and understand and relate to myself in all other aspects of who I am as a human being. And one of them is gender identity, which is what we're talking about now. So when they say that kids at 4 years old are usually by age 4 know their gender identity, what I would venture to say is that kids at age 4 know their gender identity based on those lifespan experiences up to that point. So in a way, they're echoing back not only what has been given to them by their parents, but they're also echoing back their own subjective experience that they're making sense of. Also, a lot of kids are echoing back their sex identity. They're looking at their anatomical bodies as 4 years old, and especially if they have siblings that have different anatomy, they're echoing those differences. Now, for most people, the distress, discomfort is not present. They're comfortable at this point in terms of their own subjective reality. And because they're comfortable, this is why people report, this is how I feel, and we just assume this is their gender identity, and this is how they're going to be for the rest of their life. Now, with individuals for whom gender dysphoria stemmed from physical onset, oftentimes they will have a narrative of young childhood and knowing that they're not comfortable in their physical anatomy, in their body. And this is how their subjective experiences starts to be different than that of what they're being told by the world. And this is how kids at that age are able to say, no, this is not how I see myself. I don't see myself like that. And again, it is also embedded in that particular pocket of development. So follow me here. So for most of the people, the distress is not there. For most of the people, actually, the ways that we culturally and socially look and see gender as we've been told. There's only 2 genders, and this is your gender, and that's it. Live with it. A lot of times when we're culturally told something and we believe it, and then everything in our environment supports that assumption, including not only our parents, but caregivers, even when you go to toy section in a store, it supports that assumption. We just take it for a fact, but we take things for a fact unless there's actual distress signal that is in a strong disalignment, just like with people with physical dysphoria. We don't know any difference. So as we continue through the lifespan development, Our relationship to how we see ourselves in relationship to our gender is constantly situated in our subjective experiences of life. So, for example, as we mature and go through puberty, that shapes us further in terms of how we see ourselves and our gender. As we continue and something happens to us, some kind of trauma happens, some kind of incident happens that shapes up how we see ourselves, not only as human beings, but also in relationship to our gender. As we continue and we evolve, if, for example, we continue and we're living in a context where people are talking about gender issues and we're learning about it, and that awareness and language comes into our sphere, that's also going to influence how we see and conceptualize ourselves differently. Does that make sense? I hope it does. It's very it's very, how should I say it? It's kind of embedded in and situated so much in our relationship to not only our environment, but also to our biology, also to how society sees our relationship to our biology. All of the things are all interconnected. And as we continue through the lifespan, our subjective sense of how we see ourselves changes. And our subjective experience, to see where I have that arrow going down, our subjective experience then further molds and shapes up and influences how we see our gender role, how we see our gender expression, right? How we see our even gender performance, and how we see our gender identities. They're all multi-layered and shaped up together by our subjective experiences to things. So, for example, if I grew up and in my sphere of experience, in my culture and where I grew up, women were seen as being not really having a sense of identity. Women were seen as there just to mother and stay home and to parent and to bear children and not to work. That shapes up not only my gender, how I see myself in the role of the genders that I feel comfortable with, but it also shapes up my own conception of gender identity and how I see myself. Who am I as a person? Now, when I moved to the United States, where some of the, depending to the city you live in, I moved in first to New York City, where the gender roles and the perceptions and views of women were broadened than they are in Russia. That you see how that now came into my sphere of influence. And because it's now in my sphere of influence, it is inevitably going to shape up my subjective reality in relationship to my gender identity. For most of us, gender identity is anchored by something that tends to kind of hold it much more solidly in place. People are going to say that it is anchored by sex. And therefore, they will say what you're proposing is inaccurate, because if it's anchored by sex, then that just proves that sex determines gender. I'm going to say this. For a lot of people, the only reason why it is anchored by sex or perceived to be anchored by sex, because we've been taught to see it that way. It is only anchored by sex because a lot of us don't question it. Seldom do we ask ourselves, what is our gender identity? If we take it we very quickly just say what our gender is, without really going deeper into how did that came to conceptualize, how did that came into formation. Because mostly everybody, I have yet to meet a person who have not had a discomfort, some element of discomfort with their gender role, with their gender expression, with their gender performance, and sometimes even gender identity. The difference between people who need to have an avenue in order to get more alignment with their gender identity is that the distress for these individuals over here is so mild, they seldom feel it. Or if they do feel it, it's more a distress that feels a little bit more not body-centric. It doesn't feel like something that needs to be modified. Although for a lot of people, the distress in regards to their gender role or gender expression can be pretty big. For a lot of other people over here, that is severe enough where it is just really disaligned. So I would argue that it doesn't really prove that gender is anchored by sex. I would argue that what it shows is that how predisposed we have come to see it only that way. But our development is complex. It explains why, as we go through our development, as you look on the bottom of this model, there's life development. You go through life development, and it explains why sometimes when these people severe trauma happens, and I've seen, like I said, it's very, very rare, but I've seen it where people will then shift their identities in order to cope with trauma. So now we're seeing how identity can be um, can be shaken up from the space of solidity based on what comes into your subjective reality and experience of it. This is also why we see young adults right now who are saying, I physically feel comfortable with my body, but I'm having social dysphoria because I'm starting to realize that this binary way of looking at things doesn't align with how I see and how I subjectively experience my gender identity. Why is this happening? If we're so anchored to our sex, why is this happening to individuals? Why is there social dysphoria when we're so anchored by sex? Because again, whatever comes in our sphere of influences, it shapes up how we see ourselves in relationship to our gender. Sometimes things come in that further solidify how we see it, and sometimes they come up that make us see and feel it differently. Sometimes things come up, even stereotypes come up, that even though you may realize they're stereotypes, they may still feel aligned with how you tend to see and conceptualize your subjective reality to gender. And sometimes they come up and you say, this is not true. This is not how I see myself. This is not how I see my identity in relationship to gender. This is why gender identity and your relationship to it is situated within your context. This is why historically we're seeing different representation of how it manifests, how it comes out, how we talk about it, even how dysphoria is represented. We're seeing it differently today because the world today is different. This is why we see discrepancy between older adults and how they felt and experienced gender dysphoria and their gender identity and younger adults today. Again, because it is all situated within subjective experience and the way we see and understand things. And all of those things, once they come into your environment, into sphere of your environment, will influence how you see yourself. There's no one way of describing it or seeing it. I would venture to say that the more we talk about gender identity as divorced from the deep anchor being held by sex, the more we're going to be able to realize that there's much more to us as human beings than just male and female, or man and woman, I should say. There's much more to us than that. That is just very, it's not only is it all very black and white, but if any of you ever read any kind of historical construction of gender, it is also so incredibly deeply seated within gender stereotypes. Deeply seated within gender stereotypes. There's actually any kind of person who studied biology or science will tell you that the biological differences, the actual biological differences between male and females are not as black and white as we've been taught to believe. We are not as opposite as we believe. But those are sexes. We're talking about sexes. And it would be interesting to see how if we divorce gender identity from the sexes, again, we're not negating the fact that sexes exist, but if we divorce it, it would be interesting to see how we start conceptualizing and seeing formation of gender identity. And I would venture to say that there would be much more individuals who see their gender identity much more fluid or much more malleable than static. This is why we also see individuals who are gender fluid, who are not anchored again by sex, and who can sway because their subjectivity and their subjective reality in relationship to themselves changes. Your subjective reality in relationship to yourself changes not only daily, it changes every single minute of a day because things come into your sphere of interactions. Things come into your sphere of influence. Remember, you're not like, it's not like your membrane that cannot be penetrated. You're standing on the pedestal, and everything that comes into your orbit shapes up who you are as individual. And to say that it doesn't shape up how you see yourself in relationship to your gender is uh, silly. It is simply silly. If everything that comes into your sphere shapes you up as a person, it shapes up your character, your temperament, your personality, why wouldn't it shape you up how you see yourself in relationship to gender? So as you can see, it's not as easy to wrap your head around it, right? It's such an abstract concept, but again, it's so situated in subjectivity. And the challenges with this is that, again, we're so predisposed to believe and to see gender anchored by sex, and to see that there are only two genders versus differentiating sex from gender. And this is what really at play here is because culturally, especially in the United States, that view perpetuates to such extent that almost becomes like a mind fuck to a lot of people who don't fit into that perception. We seldom, a lot of us, a lot of you who are watching this, who maybe feel like you identify strongly as one gender or another, we seldom question ourselves, how did we come to feel the way we do in regards to our gender identity? How is it that we see ourselves as this particular gender identity? But we need to be asking ourselves this question because there's no one way to feel about it, right? For some of us, gender identity is going to be anchored much strongly by one thing versus another. For some of us, the distress signal is going to be so small, it's not going to be warned, what we call gender dysphoria. For some of you, the distress signal is so big that it starts to really interfere with your life and the quality of your life and your health, and it's starting to bring up all other kind of symptoms along with it. And that's when some form of transition or medical treatment comes into place, when the distress becomes so big enough. But for some people, it's just not big enough to warrant that. Think about this relationship of gender identity to subjective experience as, for example, motherhood, right? What is motherhood? Tell me, what is motherhood? If I ask somebody, what does define motherhood? What would you tell me? Would you say motherhood is an ability to give birth to a child? We know that's not true. There's a lot of people who never gave birth to a child who have experience of motherhood, who would say they had experience, their identity is a mom, mother. They have mothered children, either the adopted kids, either from foster care, either they were married in extended families, or so many other ways. Some people even say that they have motherhood experience because they're caregivers. So what is motherhood? Do you see how even motherhood is so embedded in one's subjectivity and one's relationship to what it means to them? Gender identity is the same thing. To negate and to reduce it down to just sexes wipes out the progression of human development. And it presupposes, it goes back to this kind of point of view that this is how your gender is, your gender identity is, and it is not subject to be influenced by outside forces. How can that be? To me, as a psychologist, it makes absolutely no sense. So, as I said, this is a very heady subject and it's abstract. And it's hard to fully conceptualize and to explain. And I think that only again lends to the fact that gender identity formation is not as easy as we think. And we need to start talking about it much more and understand how it shapes up and changes for individuals throughout their lifespan. And for some people, it is maintains to be what makes them feel comfortable. And it just so happens that we've been so predisposed to see that comfort as equating and being anchored by sex. But I don't think that that's the case. So hopefully was able to make some sense out of this. Comment below. Let me know what you think, what you thought about gender identity formation. Like I said, this is heady and not so easy to understand. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.